Historians play a vital role in society. They're the people who uncover and explain the past. They describe to us what the past was like so that we can understand and learn from it. We know what happened at the Battle of Lexington and Concord because historians have researched it, allowing it to become accepted fact. Are you ready to step into the shoes of a historian? Hopefully so. In this lesson, it will be necessary to learn how to think like a historian. Here we go. This may surprise you, but historians are actually scientists. Yep, history is a science. If you major in history in most colleges, you will receive a BS, a bachelor's degree in science. In fact, in most schools, history is referred to as social science. As scientists, historians have to abide by certain rules. They can't just make things up. The history they write must be based on evidence. In conducting research, it's necessary for historians to formulate questions. The scientific method serves as a guide in this endeavor. The scientific method is a process of investigation used to arrive at a truth. It involves acquiring new knowledge or correcting and integrating previous knowledge. The steps of the scientific method are as follows. 1. Ask a question. 2. Do background research. 3. Construct a hypothesis. 4. Test your hypothesis by doing an experiment. 5. Analyze your data and draw a conclusion. And 6. Communicate your results. A really essential function of historians, and really any of us who seek to understand the past, is asking a question, or, to be more precise, formulating historical questions. So, what are some questions those interested in the past might ask? They might ask something like this. How did religious sentiment impact the development of the temperance, anti-alcohol movement in the years leading up to Prohibition? Or, were the flappers of the 1920s true feminists, or was it simply a faddish style? These are examples of historical questions, or what we might call historical inquiry. Historical questions are often complex. They ask things like how, why, or to what extent. Sometimes they ask about the relationship between two phenomena. To answer such questions, it would be necessary to do research. For a historian, this might involve looking through newspapers or publications from the time period, or watching film footage from the period. Remember, primary sources are invaluable in historical research. Primary sources are documents, objects, or other sources that were created during the time being studied. So, for example, a pamphlet from the 1860s, a sound recording from the 1930s, or film footage from World War II would all be considered primary sources. This is in contrast to secondary sources, which are sources written about the past by someone without first-hand knowledge. Secondary sources are typically based on primary sources. For example, a recent biography of George Washington would be a secondary source. So, a historian would formulate a question, do the research, then propose a theory. Remember, the hypothesis. In the field of history, this theory is often called an interpretation. An interpretation is one particular perspective or view about the past. The historian would then need to test the interpretation by making sure it's backed up by evidence. Historical evidence normally consists of primary sources. A historian would normally need to find primary source material that backs up his or her interpretation. After that, it's a matter of drawing the conclusion and communicating the results. In the field of history, this entire process is called historical methodology. Historical methodology is the process by which historians gather evidence and formulate ideas about the past. So, what we need to remember is that history involves more than just recall. It's more than memorizing dates and names. It involves critical thinking and analysis. It involves tracing cause and effect. It involves making predictions and formulating interpretations. One more thing. Sometimes historical methodology can be tricky. For example, sometimes two historians can examine the same exact evidence and arrive at different interpretations. When that happens, sometimes one interpretation wins out and becomes accepted, while other times the two interpretations remain as rival views. So, while history is considered scientific, there's also a subjective element present at times. But that is a whole other lesson. Bottom line to remember, history involves critical thinking. Those who seek to understand the past must formulate questions about the past and answer those questions based on historical evidence. Now, let's review our key terms. The scientific method guides historians in understanding the past. The scientific method is a process of investigation used to arrive at a truth. It involves acquiring new knowledge or correcting and integrating previous knowledge. Primary sources are documents, objects, or other sources that were created during the time being studied. By contrast, secondary sources are sources written about the past by someone without first-hand knowledge. Biographies are a common secondary source. An interpretation is one particular perspective or view about the past. And finally, historical methodology is the process by which historians gather evidence and formulate ideas about the past.